There is peace now, and that peace will continue for as long as it suits our needs. But make no mistake, this is not a peace forged out of necessity between rival nations of equal strength. It is more like the calm between storms, and the next storm, I think, will be far deadlier than the last.
The central political tension of Skyrim is the Civil War. On one side, you have an ethnocentric separatist movement in the Stormcloaks, and on the other side of this conflict, we have a colonial empire in a state of decay, suffering from 2 centuries of turmoil, delivered by varieties of apocalyptic Daedric invasions, loss of provincial control, and the rising threat that is the Aldmeri Dominion, which of course culminated in the Great War itself, resulting in a fragile peace and the controversial signing of the White-Gold Concordat. This treaty, accepted 26 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, stipulated many economic and political conditions, as well as an edict which forbade the worship of the ninth divine, Talos, the apotheosized form of Tiber Septim, the Third Empire's founder. At this time, Talos had been a part of the Imperial cult's spiritual canon for well over 5 centuries, and so this religious imposition made by their Elven adversaries was not looked upon kindly by citizens of the Empire. There are many arguments to be made about the illegitimacy or legitimacy of either side of the Civil War. Each faction has their merits, but make no mistake, neither side forgets that the Aldmeri Dominion, headed by the Thalmor, is the true enemy. But for those well versed in the long histories of the Elder Scrolls, you would know that this conflict has its roots in the very moments of creation itself. The Thalmor are the culmination of thousands of years of ideology, mythology, and political reality which has set the stage for the latest and perhaps final iteration of this eternal conflict. The Thalmor are weirder than you think.
Nords can be quite stubborn. They're slow to change their ways, and we find more heretics every day. But mark me well. I will purge the heresy from this land as surely as the flame burns the flesh from the bone.
But first we must set the stage. As I just said, the ideology of the Thalmor is the tip of the iceberg, underneath which lies millennia of mythological and cultural animosity pointed toward the races of man and its empires. In order to prevent this video from spiraling outward in scope, I'm going to keep a tight focus on the Altmeri perspective, as this is what is ultimately important when trying to understand how the long-lived, proud race of the Altmer came to be defined by the black and gold-clad supremacist organization that is the Thalmor.
You have the honor of addressing a member of the Thalmor. Bask in it.
The Elder Scrolls universe is not a world of certainty. For starters, all information, bar I suppose the direct experiences of the player, is subject to the unreliable narrator. 90% of all information is delivered to you via in-universe authors or NPCs which regale you with their particular perspective. There is an intentional lack of an omniscient author explaining how everything really is. Ultimately, this is what makes the Elder Scrolls such a vibrant setting and one so full of mystery and wonder. Gods and supernatural forces are undeniable phenomena. Magic is a universally experienced truth. In this sense, within the Orbis, that is, the universe of the Elder Scrolls, the supernatural is really just the natural. This is a vital point to understand when analysing the various belief systems of Tamriel's cultures. As you've surely heard me mention many times in videos before, in general, though there are exceptions, the races of man have a belief in gods that created them, whereas elves hold the idea that they are fallen. They were once like gods but had their divinity robbed from them. Of course, there is much nuance and variation on each of the tales about their fall from divinity. However, the classic Aldmeri belief boils down to this. Lorkhan tricked the original spirits, the Et Arda, into the project of Mundus, the mortal plane. Some refused to help. These are the Daedra, which loosely means not our ancestors, and the other gods, the Aedra, which translates to ancestors, whom willingly invested themselves in creation without realizing, at the time, that this would come at the cost of their own power. This was a trick. As Lorkhan knew, this world contained more limitations than not, and was therefore hardly a thing of Anu at all. Mundus was the house of Sithis. As their aspects began to die off, many of the Et Arda vanished completely. Some escaped, like Magnus, and this is why there are no limitations to magic. Others, like Ifri, transformed themselves into the Elnefey, the Earthbones, so that the whole world might not die. Some had to marry and make children just to last. Each generation was weaker than the last, and soon there were Aldmer. Darkness caved in. Lorkhan made armies out of the weakest souls and named them men, and they brought Sithis into every quarter. Auri-el, king of the Aldmer, led his forces against the armies of men who fought in the name of Lorkhan, a terrible war which reshaped the land itself. Finally, Trinimac, Auri-el's greatest knight, knocked Lorkhan down in front of his army and reached in with more than hands to take his heart. He was undone. The men dragged Lorkhan's body away and swore blood vengeance on the heirs of Auri-el for all time. But when Trinimac and Auri-el tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, it laughed at them. It said, "This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other." So Auri-el fastens the thing to an arrow and let it fly long into the sea, where no aspect of the new world may ever find it. Broadly, this sets up the dichotomy of elves versus men and definitively sets up Lorkhan as the enemy of the Aldmer, the doom drum which trapped them in a mortal plane of cruelty and misery, severed from the divine light of Anu. Naturally, you may imagine that this would, of course, bring the two races into an eternal conflict, as has proven to be the case. The races of man have historically worshipped some variation of Lorkhan, such as Shezarr or Shor. To them, he is the very champion of their cause, a martyr of sorts, and more broadly, the gods are considered mothers and fathers to men who bestowed upon them the beauty of life and creation, a far cry from the Elven perspective. For example, listen to this Elven poem dated to the Second Era. "Listen round, I've a warning to sound about an overgrown weed, and I don't mean to forebode, but this little ode is a lesson you must heed. Now our story unfolds upon a pitiful mould made to thrive on rot. This unsightly staff was a trickster's last laugh long after his battle was fought. We called it the Sundering, in case you were wondering, when the heavens dropped out of the sky. They hit with a thud and gave birth to the mud, making up this mortal sty. It was a hell of a mess, but I digress, my story's about the swine. What took root in this land were seeds called man that sprung up like fungus from grime. Their lives may be short and lacking import, but keep an eye to their blundering. It's tempting to jest about this simple pest until you've seen their plundering. For when men bound to the doom drum sound, you'll learn what the corpse god wrought. Even Trinimac didn't know, with his final blow, just how badly he'd been caught." This foundational understanding of elves versus men will be very important to keep in mind for the length of this video, but mythological underpinnings aside, there too lie vast biological differences between the races of elves and men which have informed cultural perceptions of one another and hence determined the fate of their interactions. First and foremost, the elven races are long-lived, typically with lifetimes spanning centuries, and in more exceptional cases we have individuals who have lived for thousands of years. For a human to live past a century is an amazing feat in itself. Most would be lucky to live to 80, and considering the violent nature of the world, I'd be willing to guess that life expectancy is far lower. This produces a stark contrast. On one hand, we have a rapid generational turnover, new people, new ideas coming all of the time. And on the other hand, we have the long-lived elves, who, as a side note, according to some sources, reproduce far less in number, and so with lower generational turnover and smaller new generations, it appears that you have thousand-year-old boomers dictating the cultural conventions and laws, while the smaller population of youth is culturally reabsorbed as most countercultures are too small to gain any real traction and make any meaningful impact to change the status quo. Pair that with a culture that demands perfection and conformity, and you have a recipe for a stagnant culture, even if it is one of order, stability, and antiquity. This largely applies to Alinor, formerly known as the Somerset Isles. While countercultures have largely failed in the Altmeri society, there have been many dissident movements that emerged as a result of colonization and exodus. For example, the Durrani, who claimed High Rock and in essence sired the Breton race, or the Aelids, who took Cyrodiil and enslaved the local populace of men and worshipped the Daedra, or rather the Velothi exodus, which fled the stringent false dogmas of Alinor and founded a new culture in Morrowind based on the Triangled Truth. But within the bounds of Alinor itself, the culture retains a sense of ideological purity, exiling those who are not fit for their society. We shall talk about alaxon, that is the ideological preoccupation with perfection, later on. But as a brief tangent, it is also worth noting that one of the defining characteristics of the Altmeri society, that of the High Elves, versus the Aldmeri society from which it emerged, is itself an ideological dispute. Arguably, it is this ideological shift that caused the several migrations out from Alinor. Early Aldmer society was agricultural and politically egalitarian. A system of ancestor worship had been exported whole from Aldmeris, and it brought with it a communal spirit that served the early settlers of Somerset well. When the Aldmer came together as a people to create the Crystal Tower, it was not a monument to any king or god, but rather to the spirit of the Elven people, living and dead. Within the glittering walls of the tower are housed the graves of the early Aldmeri settlers, preserved forever as a lasting symbol of the power of the people for that brief moment in history, fully unified. Gradually, as the society grew, social stratification increased. A hierarchy of classes began to form, which is still largely enforced in Somerset to this day. At the top are the wise, teachers and priests, followed by artists, princes, warriors, landowners, merchants, and workers. Below workers were the beasts, such as the enslaved goblins, who the Aldmer used to perform the jobs beneath the dignity of the very least of them. The religion of the people also changed because of this change in society. No longer did the Aldmer worship their own ancestors, but the ancestors of their betters. Auri-el, Trinimac, Sirabane, and Finaster are among the many ancestor spirits who became gods. A group of elders rebelled against this trend, calling themselves the Psijjics, the keepers of the old ways of Aldmeris. With their mystical powers, they were able to settle in Artaeum, away from what they considered the corruption of their society. They continued to return to the land to act as advisors, but never again would they call Somerset home. It was about this time that many Aldmer left Somerset to settle the mainland of Tamriel. There was probably no single reason for this second exodus of Aldmer, but some evidence, such as the famed Ramaran tapestries, the very one that shows some of the creatures mentioned above, show how untouched and beautiful the mainland was considered to be by the Aldmer. Expeditions such as those taken by Topal the Pilot and others had painted an image in their mind of a great land where even workers at the lowest end of the Somerset hierarchy could live as kings. The prophet Veloth was among those who led a group of discontented Aldmer away from Somerset to a new promised land. According to the traditions of Somerset, the Aldmer who went to be free on the mainland became all the disparate elven folk of history, Khyma, Bosmer, Ayleid. The ones who stayed behind became the Altmer. Even the earliest records of Somerset, however, shed no light on the origins of the Dwemer, who already occupied the northeast of Tamriel when Veloth and his people arrived there. This is all important to keep in mind, and later in the video we shall be exploring more intently the differences between the current-day Altmeri philosophies as opposed to the old ways of the Psijjic order, which arguably retains more similarity to the earliest Aldmeri beliefs. It is interesting that in the College of Winterhold questline, the Thalmor and the Psijjics seem absolutely opposed to one another.
All you need to know is that the Psijjic Order is a rogue organization, believing themselves to be above the law. They have clashed with the Aldmeri Dominion before, and I have no intention of allowing that to happen here.
But more on that later. Just bear in mind that despite the traditions of the Altmer, which express an elven superiority and have reached their zenith form in the radical Thalmor, the facts are that they may actually be a gross distortion of the original Aldmeri views. Let that stew in your mind as we continue. Naturally, the Elves' long lifespan and their strong, long-held traditions with fewer youth-driven countercultures has led to a negative reputation amongst men. The races of man often view the Elves as haughty and arrogant, with perhaps the Bosmer as an exception to this stigma. And this is not exactly an unfair perception. Notoriously, the Elves are quite isolationist and xenophobic, such is the case with even the mainland cultures such as the Khyma, Dunmer, or the Ayleids. And while there are most certainly such sentiments found among the races of man, multiculturalism has largely been a project of man. Mind you, these multicultural, multi-ethnic empires arose out of conquest, colonization, and all manner of violence, and let us not pretend either that the cultural imperative of the empire does not reign supreme, but still, elves traditionally, in perhaps all their societal incarnations with the exception of perhaps the Bosmer, have believed in a cultural and biological superiority to the races of man. But before we continue with this train of thought, I want to let you know that we've been fortunate enough to have a sponsor for this video, Raycon. They've sent us their essential open earbuds, which right now, during Raycon's anniversary, are 30% off. These earbuds have become my go-to set every time I leave the house. Unlike typical earbuds, the essential open earbuds keep your ears open to your surroundings while still delivering crystal clear sound. They sit just outside your ear canal, which lets me hear traffic when I'm out on walks, listening to an audiobook, or just to talk with Michael in between sets while getting a music-fueled workout in. Their open ear design is not only lightweight but comfortable for all-day use, using a rotating ear hook that adapts to your ear for a personalized, secure fit for any activity. Their multi-point connection capability means you can switch seamlessly between devices, and best of all, they last for 8 hours of continuous playback. And if you really want to adventure away from your screen, they've got up to 36 hours total battery life if you include the charging case. That's a lot of touching grass. If you want to help support the channel by getting premium big brand audio quality at half the price, click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/fudgemuppetopen to get 30% off the essential open earbuds. With over 3 million happy customers and a 30-day happiness guarantee, there's zero reason to overpay.
The Thalmor saved all of elven kind during the Oblivion Crisis. We've been watching over our lands for 200 years. We refounded the Aldmeri Dominion, an alliance between us and our Bosmer cousins. You might know them from their common name, Wood Elves. We intend to prove the superiority of Myr over man, 1 century at a time.
At the core of it, I do believe this comes down to man's quicker generational turnover with their short lives. Men forget. Grievances between races and cultures disappear with time. They are often reignited at the drop of a hat, but you are far more likely to see fluidity in culture and in groups compared to the more classically monolithic Elven cultures. Let us consider Nordic culture in the last 2 centuries and its imperialization. Nords have traditionally worshipped their own pantheon of gods, Kine, Stun, Mara, and so on. This pantheon was part of the synthesis which made up the 8 divines of the imperial cult, Kine becoming Kinnereth, Stun becoming Stendar, etc. However, for most of Skyrim's history, they have remained true to their traditional pantheon. Even in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, set at the end of the Third Era, the Nords of Bruma, the city closest to the border of Skyrim, stick fervently to their old gods, which really is just the traditional Nordic versions of similar entities.
We're trying to bring the comfort of the chapel to the Nords here, but Bruma's Nords stick to their heathen gods and uncivilized practices.
The chapel has made enemies here in the past. The Nords prefer their dragon Ismir to our father Akatosh.
I'm here to show Bruma's errant Nords the path to the true faith. They must put aside their heathen gods and worship the Nine.
Hanmund is my live-in partner. No offense, but I don't want to hear about any Mara Mother Mild and Chapel family business. Hanmund and I live together in the old Nord way. Good enough for my fa and ma, and good enough for me.
2 centuries later, in Skyrim itself, the imperial cult is the dominant faith of the province. Marriage is held in chapels with the blessings of Mara, and most worship is done in the imperial way. Only the fringes of society still hold to the traditional Nordic gods, people like Froki Wettedblade, who lives in his cabin high in the mountains.
They're stolen idols, imposter gods, sold by silver tongues. No thank you. Froki will not forget Kine or her sacred trials. Those sycophants in the temple would call her Kinnereth, just a pale shadow of the truth, like all the temple divines. Kine, blessed warrior wife, Shore's widow, sacred to any true Nord hunter. She's the mother of men and beasts, and her veil is the storm.
Consider all of this from an Elven perspective. You are a high elf that's, say, 20 years old in the time of Oblivion, which is the end of the Third Era. You live to 220 years old around the time of Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and in that time, your lifetime, you have witnessed Nords staunchly traditional, sticking to their heathen gods, so much so that even the Nords in the Cyrodiilic city of Bruma hold on to them, and then within just 2 centuries, all of Skyrim has mostly abandoned traditional Nordic notions of their gods, instead favouring the Imperial Divines. So much so that even the very civil war that they fight today is based upon the fight for the right to openly worship Talos, primarily an Imperial god. You can understand how, as a long-lived elf, you may see the races of man as chaotic and fickle, and as a byproduct of this, you may develop a superiority complex of a sort. But I don't want to dwell for too long on the broad strokes and ancient grievances. This is a video about the Thalmor and more broadly the Altmeri Dominion that it governs. Well, since we were just talking about the Elven superiority complex, it provides a fantastic segue into the formation of the first Altmeri Dominion and to the creation, or rather proliferation, of the Thalmor. The foundation of the first Altmeri Dominion finds itself in a time of great crisis. The fall of the Riemann dynasty, the founders of the Second Empire, ended the First Era, yet this incarnation of the Empire still lived on under the Akaviri potentates for over 4 centuries into the Second Era. Yet this state of affairs ended year 430 of the Second Era when potentate Savrian Chorak was assassinated. This is considered the end of the Second Empire and the beginning of a period known as the Interregnum. The Second Empire at this point had conquered all of mainland Tamriel but for Morrowind, protected by its living gods Sothosil, Almalexia, and Vivec. It is hard to get exact clarity on the position of the Somerset Isles during this time of history. However, from what can be pieced together, the Somerset Isles was not a province of the Empire as such, though maybe it was a sort of vassal state in some honorary capacity at times. The truth of the matter is a little confusing. Sources state that tithes were paid to the Riemann Empire and diplomats were entertained, but the Altmer remained intensely isolationist and withdrawn from the mainland affairs of the world. I would think that overall it's safe to say that the Somerset Isles was not a part of the Riemann Empire, especially since Tiber Septim's conquest of the Somerset Isles with the Numidium was a particularly noted feat and historical anomaly that cemented his Third Empire as the only one to ever conquered all of Tamriel. So this is all to say that at this point in history, Alinor, or rather the Somerset Isles, had maintained its isolationist state of affairs for what is essentially all of recorded history and beyond, that is, since the Merethic era. The year is 533 of the Second Era, and Cyrodiil, the seat of both the Elysian and Riemann empires, is conquered by Durkarak the Black Drake, a pumped-up Reachman warchief who establishes himself as Emperor of Cyrodiil. He establishes the Longhouse dynasty, which includes 3 emperors of Reachman descent, which lasts for a mere 44 years before it is snuffed out by a Clovian warlord and his rebellion. The leader of this rebellion, Varin Aquilarios, kills Leovic, the last of the Longhouse emperors, and establishes himself as sovereign. He assembles 5 companions to embark on a quest for the long-lost Amulet of Kings, and while attempting to use it to become Dragonborn and re-establish the covenant with Akatosh, one of these companions, Manamako, betrays him mid-ritual and uses it to bring about the Soul Burst, an explosion of arcane energy causing mages to die or go mad, and Daedra began appearing in greater numbers. All colours of disaster ensue, notably Molag Bal begins the Plane Meld, the process with which he tries to pull Tamriel into his own realm of Cold Harbor. You've got to imagine the High Elves of Alinor are just watching this absolute shit show unfold over the last few centuries and just looking upon the races of man as absolute monkeys. I mean, they always have really, but during the Interregnum, it was much more like watching those monkeys play Bop It with nuclear launch codes. Hence, an interventionist attitude emerges. Enter Queen Ayrenn. Formerly, Altmeri sentiments have been to just preserve their little islands of peace and interact with Tamriel only as they see fit, but attitudes were changing, and at the head of this change was the recently returned Queen Ayrenn. Ayrenn is remarkably unique among the Elven monarchs in that she was incredibly young for the role, and she had travelled the mainland of Tamriel extensively, becoming keenly aware of the existential threats that were unfolding. She came back with a distinct philosophy. I have no hatred for the races of man, but they are young. Like all children, they are driven by emotion. They lack the wisdom that comes with age. I would sooner place an Altmer infant on the ruby throne than surrender Tamriel to their capricious whims. The Altmer, the Bosmer, and the Khajiit share the common traits of intelligence, patience, and reason. We do not seek riches or plunder. Domination is not our goal, nor is the acclamation of power for its own sake. Today we make our stand. Today we take back the ruby throne, which is ours by ancient right, and the blessings of the divines. Stand with us. Ayrenn was born year 555 of the Second Era to King Hydaelith and Kinlady Tuinden. Her birth was of auspicious omens significant to the Altmer, and she was widely celebrated for 55 days. It was foretold that Princess Ayrenn would reflect the restless and turbulent times in which she was born, and so it came to pass. Nimble and quick-witted, she was quick to master the lessons of her tutors, and from an early age often adopted unorthodox approaches to schoolwork. In fact, she sometimes became so engrossed in her independent studies that her whereabouts were unknown for days at a time. She would often return from these field trips with unusual knowledge and display remarkable new skills. One day, an evening star of the year 573, the entire royal family of Alinor gathered at the Crystal Tower to celebrate Ayrenn's matriculation to the Sapiarch's Labyrinth, where she was to study Altmeri regal praxis and ceremoniarchy for the requisite 3,555 days. But Ayrenn didn't arrive. Somewhere between the palace and the tower, the princess disappeared, and despite a 17th degree inquiry by the justiciars, she was nowhere to be found. The Sapiarchs, however, reported that the night of her disappearance was filled with signs and portents. The constellation of the Lady seeming to ride the constellation of the Steed, the great Ori spun backwards, and a young eaglet was found atop the statue of Topal the Explorer. At age 18, Ayrenn disappeared to adventure the lands of Tamriel, and there are many stories about her endeavors. That she sailed as first mate with a pirate captain from Anvil, disguised herself as a Dunmer in order to read the indigo tomes in the vaults of Necrom, bested the dervishes of Rihard at their own sword dance, and even outdrank Queen Mabyan Flamehair of Windhelm in a mead-slamming contest. Ayrenn returned unexpected after the death of King Hydaelith. At age 25, she was crowned Queen Ayrenn of Alinor, a most unordinary situation. Ayrenn formed the First Aldmeri Dominion, an alliance made with King Eredin Cameron of Valenwood and Lord Goreshri of the Elsewhere Confederacy. The formation of this alliance was known as the Elden Accord, and its primary purpose was to take the heart of Cyrodiil and prevent the fickle races of man from destroying the world. The First Aldmeri Dominion became a major player in the Three Banners War, competing with the Ebonheart Pact and the Daggerfall Covenant. Only the Aldmeri, the High Elves and their noble allies, the Wood Elves and Catmen, have the wisdom and restraint to peaceably rule the disparate peoples of Tamriel. Though we are reluctant to take up this burden, events have shown that we must. Recent events prove that the Dragonbreak was not a unique event. Men always follow the destructive path of their defender and apologist, the missing god whom we shall not name. This ends here. Once again, elves shall rule Tamriel from White-Gold Tower, this time forever. The world has gone wrong, and we must put it right. March proudly beneath the eagle banner of the Aldmeri Dominion. Queen Ayrenn is one of the key figures of Elven history, and arguably she is the catalyst for interventionist sentiment and revival of the concept of Elven unity, an Elven dominion. Though while Ayrenn may have been the catalyst in many ways for what over 1,000 years later would result in the rise of the Thalmor of today, Ayrenn herself would not share their sentiments entirely. She transformed Altmeri society in many ways, inviting greater integration with the broader world and investing in its security. Queen Ayrenn opened the Somerset Isles to foreigners with a royal decree, and the lesser races who would come as friends, traders, travelers, and immigrants alike would be welcomed. Since assuming the throne, she has brought some innovations to the rule of our land, but this is as foretold at the time of her auspicious birth, and the Sapiarchs, one and all, have endorsed her modernizations. As you can imagine, Queen Ayrenn was quite the disruptive figure. After thousands of years of isolation, Alinor's borders were flung open, and Aldmeri soldiers would go die on foreign soil for attainment of a greater good, an establishment of Elven rule on Tamriel once more. Yet the First Aldmeri Dominion would not last, and nor would any of the major players of the Three Banners War manage to take claim of the Ruby Throne. Ayrenn established the First Aldmeri Dominion, but what of the Thalmor? Once the Thalmor was an obscure bureau of the Somerset Isles, tasked with safeguarding Altmeri heritage. This was its position since its inception, but at the time of Queen Ayrenn, it was elevated to become the executive arm of the Dominion. It incorporates representatives from all 3 of the Dominion's member races in ratios appropriate to their administrative abilities. The Fists of Thalmor is an effectuation unit of officers deployed when stern measures must be taken to enforce adherence to Thalmor dicta. The Justiciars are more conventional law enforcement officers, often local in origin and jurisdiction. In essence, the Thalmor's history is tightly intertwined with the formation of the Aldmeri Dominion. It must be re-emphasized that while the formation of the Aldmeri Dominion under the direction of the Thalmor Council and Queen Ayrenn is one that envisions progress and modern values, make no mistake that the Thalmor has always been entrenched in a sense of Elven superiority. Let us not forget that fundamentally, the Aldmeri Dominion is built upon the idea of Elven supremacy, even if its initial incarnation was not as ideologically hateful of the other races. The Empire of Cyrodiil was founded on the blood of elves and battened on elven genocide. For thousands of years, central Tamriel has whelped human empires, each bloodier than the last, spreading grief and savagery to every corner of the continent. We, Altmer, have long stood by, patiently waiting for men to exhaust their penchant for warfare and embrace civilized behavior. But we can no longer abet the cycle of bloodshed by abstination. Now the Aldmeri Dominion marches to Cyrodiil. There will be peace, yes, once the cancer of human imperialism is extirpated utterly. Not to get into a game of tit for tat nor justify the actions of the Elysian Order, but Ankatar of Shimmerine, the sapiarch of indoctrination, mind you, happily leaves out the fact that the men that founded the Empire of Cyrodiil were once brutally enslaved by elves and liberated themselves from the torturous conditions of the Ayleids. Fair is fair. Elven superiority, it seems, is endemic to the Altmeri culture. It is baked into their very philosophy. All that changes is their method of approach when dealing with the lesser races. The specifics of the dissolution of the First Aldmeri Dominion are largely unknown, and the latter half of the interregnum is fractious and violent. Tamriel remained a land of petty kings and border wars. Come year 830 of the Second Era, we have the rise of the Second Aldmeri Dominion. The Cameron dynasty had ruled Valenwood in some form since the beginning of recorded history. In fact, the founding of the Cameron dynasty by King Eplir marks the beginning of the First Era. Well, at the end of the Second Era, there was yet another civil war unfolding in Valenwood between several Cameron heirs, involving disputes with the Colovian estates and several factions vying for power. The High Elves intervened, invading Valenwood and establishing a provincial government in the form of the Thalmor. They brought stability to Valenwood and its borders, and the Second Aldmeri Dominion was formed. Admittedly, a lot of the information about the Second Dominion is coloured by Imperial propaganda, as naturally they were soon the prime enemy of the Rising Dragon in the north. 22 years after the formation of the Second Aldmeri Dominion, the Tiber Wars began. Surely you are familiar. General Talos fights on behalf of King Kulakain of the Colovian estates. There is the taking of Sankator, the assassination of Kulakain. Talos turned Emperor Tiber Septim. For decades the Tiber Wars ensue as he conquered every land of Tamriel, including even Morrowind, yet with the greater concessions of the Armistice. Nothing is known of the circumstances of the personal meeting between Septim and Vivec, or where it took place, or the preliminaries which must have preceded the treaty. The public reason was to protect the identities of the agents involved. In the West, speculation has centered around the role of Zurin Arctus in brokering the agreement. In the East, rumors suggest that Vivec offered Numidium to aid in the conquest of the Altmer and Somerset Isle in return for significant concessions to preserve self-rule, house traditions, and religious practices in Morrowind. The acquisition of the Numidium was vital. The giant brass god of the Dwemer, a monument to their hubris, a 1,000-foot-tall automaton, a golem or atronach of sorts, a weapon of mass destruction. The Imperial battle mage Zurin Arctus helped restore the Numidium to a working condition, and there's a lot of complicated metafics going on here that I'm just going to glaze over. See the Arcturian heresy for more. But to pass out what is relevant to our investigation of the Thalmor, Tiber Septim had full control of the rebuilt Numidium and set about to do what had never been done before: to conquer the Elves of Alinor. Year 896 of the Second Era, the Numidium is activated near the city of Rimmen in Elsewhere, and it brings the Second Aldmeri Dominion to its knees. One must imagine the burning forests of Valenwood, lakes scalding beneath the mighty steps of Walk Brass. Imagine the horror. The elves of Somerset eating their meal with family and friends, perfectly ordered, everything placed precisely, every motion intentional. When suddenly, the silverware tremors, chandelier glass rattles, screams rise from below, and from the balcony, apocalypse is witnessed. A great head of brass emerges from the ocean, vaporous brine steaming from its rising body as it carves craters into the beachhead with its steam-molten steps. An unholy choir rattles from its hollows as siren sounds shatter stone, flesh, and bone alike. The Altmer weave their magic against the great nullifier, moved to tears as their power is absorbed by the logic of zero. The fabric of time and space shimmers as Alinor becomes a sonic wasteland. The elves kneel before the Emperor Tiber Septim, conqueror of all Tamriel. There is much conjecture and mystery about what happened after, stories that allude to other abuses of the Numidium, but what we do know is that shortly after the conquest of Somerset, the Numidium was destroyed and its pieces scattered all across Tamriel. Some say it was the Underking, but now's not the time to speak of that. What is most vital to understand from all of this is that the elves were humiliated in a way they have never been before, forced to bend the knee and reckon with a power that they could not stop. Remember before when I said the elves must have envisioned the races of man as monkeys playing Bop It with the nuclear launch codes? Well, it seems that Tiber Septim hit the right sequence. The details of the conquest of Alinor are relatively scarce, but there are some interesting details provided by Michael Kirkbride regarding the siege. It's not the brass god that wrecks everything so much as it is all the planets and timelines that orbit it, singing world refusals. The surrender of Alinor happened in 1 hour, but Numidium's siege lasted from the Mythic era until long into the 5th. Some mirror logicians of the Altmer fight it still in chrysalis shells that phase in and out of Tamrielic prime, and their brethren know nothing of their purpose unless they stare too long and break their own possipoints. This also ties in with Coda, the project of Michael Kirkbride, which involves a post-apocalyptic 5th era story set on Massa, the larger of the moons. Regardless of its canon validity, I do think it's a very cool idea, especially since the Numidium is tightly associated with dragon breaks, that is, when time breaks. For example, the Numidium is used at the end of the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, which results in the Warp in the West, or rather the Miracle of Peace, a knitting of the timelines in which various endings are consolidated into a single stream, yet contain contradictory impossibilities. The main reason I like this idea is that besides the fun metaphysical weirdness, it thematically adds an insult to injury for the Thalmor and Altmer more broadly, imagining that they simultaneously are trying to further their goals in the 4th era, while also must help reinforce an apocalyptic siege that is ongoing in a sort of alternate adjacent timeline. Ultimately, this falls into the non-canon category, but it is most certainly fun to think about. Even without the mirror logician quackery, it is this moment when the Numidium is unleashed upon the Altmer that provides the impetus for the Thalmor of the modern day. The 3rd era opens with the affirmation of Tiber Septim as ruler of Tamriel, as well as the dissolution of the 2nd Aldmeri Dominion. The Thalmor disappear from significance for quite some time.
But you were once man, aye, and as man you said, "Let me show you the power of Talos Stormcrown, born of the north, where my breath is long winter. I breathe now in royalty and reshape this land which is mine. I do this for you, Red Legions, for I love you!"
In between the demise of the 2nd Aldmeri Dominion and the eventual ascension of the 3rd Aldmeri Dominion, we have 4 centuries of context which contributes to its emergence. We just spoke about how Tiber Septim used the Numidium, essentially a superweapon, to lay waste to the Elves of Somerset and force their surrender to his will. This was the greatest mockery that Alinor had ever faced. For 38 years, the Emperor Tiber reigned supreme. It was a lawful, pious, and glorious age when justice was known to one and all, from serf to sovereign. On Tiber's death, it reigned for an entire fortnight, as if the land of Tamriel itself was weeping. Now, importantly, upon his death, as the Orthodox story goes, Tiber Septim ascended to godhood and became the 9th divine. I am going to sidestep the Arcturian heresy and any weird Dragon Break, Daggerfall type stuff, because in reality it's just not relevant to the Elven viewpoint. The supposed apotheosis of Tiber Septim, a man, is an affront to the Elves of Alinor, whether or not there is any reality to the situation. However, after their conquest at his hands and continual domination, any such elven sentiment was smothered and the Empire's faith in the 9 divines reigned supreme, meaning they could not outright reject his godhood. It is worth noting, however, that the Altmeri difficulty with the supposed apotheosis of Tiber Septim is not based upon any supposed metaphysical impossibility of a mortal ascending to godhood, but rather specifically because he was a man.
It's a religious matter. The Thalmor do not recognize Talos as a god. He was only a man, and does not deserve a place in our pantheon.
If you look to the traditional pantheon of the Altmer, you will find a series of ancestor heroes who ascended to Aetherius and rejoined Anu, those who became reunited with the divinity that was robbed from them by Lorkhan. Remember, in the Altmeri view, Elvenkind is descended from gods, hence the gods are known as Daedra, meaning ancestors. The term Daedra has come to a broader use across Tamriel, as to distinguish between the gods of creation and the gods of oblivion, designated as Daedra, but these terms are Elven in origin, and in an Altmeri context are meant very literally. From the book The Varieties of Faith. Auri-el, king of the Aldmer. The Elven Akatosh is Auri-el. Auri-el is the soul of Anu-el, who in turn is the soul of Anu the Everything. He is the chief of most Aldmeri pantheons. Most Altmeri and Bosmeri claim direct descent from Auri-el. In his only known moment of weakness, he agreed to take his part in the creation of the mortal plane, that act which forever sundered the Elves from the spirit worlds of eternity. To make up for it, Auri-el led the original Aldmer against the armies of Lorkhan in Mythic times, vanquishing that tyrant and establishing the first kingdoms of the Altmer, Altmora and Old Elnefey. He then ascended to heaven in full observance of his followers so that they might learn the steps needed to escape the mortal plane. There is a direct sense of kinship between Elves and the Daedra. Auri-el was their king, who lived amongst them and fought against Lorkhan and his vile armies of men. Auri-el was then to have said ascended to the heavens before the Aldmer so that they too could follow. Consider that many of the Altmeri gods are painted into the pantheon as associates or members of Auri-el's court. For example, Trinimac is the champion of Auri-el, the mighty warrior who slew Lorkhan. Or Xerxes, the Altmeri god of ancestry and secret knowledge, was the scribe of Auri-el. Mara, goddess of love and fertility, was considered the wife of Auri-el. Presumably, these figures were contemporary with Auri-el himself at the dawn. However, there are other examples of apotheosis that occurred later. For example, Sirabane, who is known as the Warlock's god. He participated in the fall of the Slode as part of the All-Flags Navy, which happened in the late First Era, and he is known as one of the youngest divines amongst the Altmer. Another example is Finaster, the hero god of the Somerset Isles, the wayfarer who taught the Altmer to extend their lives by 100 more years by simply shortening their walking stride. Like with all things mythology in the Elder Scrolls, there is far more nuance and contradiction found within sources. For example, the Snow Elves had a temple to Sirabane, but Sirabane was supposedly contemporary with the All-Flags Navy in the late First Era, and Snow Elf society predates this by millennia. Perhaps he was already some kind of demigod-like status and lived for all of that time. It gets complicated, but we must also remember that Altmeri society itself is a departure from the traditional Aldmeri society, that's with a D, moving away from the worship of their many ancestors to just the worship of their betters, the most elite of their society, the kings and great warriors and scholars and such. This is why the Psijjics peeled away from Alinor in the earliest days of the Merethic. We will circle back to that later, but all of this is to say that fundamentally the Elves do not disagree with the concept of apotheosis in general. In fact, they explicitly believe in it. Rather, they find the idea that a man that is a weak creature of Lorkhan could do so. Anti-Talos, not anti-Apotheosis.
The Empire, in its wisdom, has come to recognize Talos worship as a barbaric remnant of a bygone age. Talos was a heroic man, but not a god. It pains the Altmer that we must remind our younger cousins of the difference.
Without a doubt, there are firm realities which prove Talos as a deity or being of great power, no matter the methods of his ascension. I won't get into the weeds of Kim and changed landscapes, nor will I get into avatars and blessings and such right now. Mythology is complicated and particularly ambiguous when it comes to the Daedra or divines, and what is particularly difficult to grapple with is the idea that beliefs actually have the ability to shape reality. Throughout the Elder Scrolls games, we've experienced afterlives such as the Far Shores and Sovngarde. We have seen realms and powers of culturally specific conceptions of deities in Elsewhere and Valenwood, and ultimately there is incredible overlap and contradictions that we experience in-game that don't seem to map onto each particular mythology cleanly. What is the truth of it all? Is it Alkosh, Auri-el, Ruptga, or Akatosh? Is it Shor? Is it Lorkhan? We have seen the heart of Lorkhan in Morrowind, yet we have been to the halls of Sovngarde, while also we have witnessed the Dark Heart in Blackreach. So is it the Khajiit version, Lorkhaj, that is the most accurate? It's hard to tell. Everything is filtered through perspective, and hence some have come to the idea that either because of the chaos that was the Dawn Era, a period in which time was not yet linear, that they are all simultaneously true and contradict, like the events of a Dragon Break. And yet there are other ideas which explain things in terms of the Oribos as a mythic landscape, which can be shaped by the will or belief of the minds within it. We aren't going to solve this now. However, the realities of Tamriel on the ground floor during the Third Era is that Tiber Septim is believed to have ascended to godhood as Talos, the Ninth Divine. The Elves of Somerset, as a province of the Empire, were forced to accept this, at least publicly. For centuries, the Elves were forced to accept this shame. I think before we address the Thalmor as we know them today in the Third Aldmeri Dominion, I think it might be wise to dig a little deeper into Altmeri theology so that as we approach the more out there concepts, we have a firm baseline understanding of their beliefs. Downstream of the idea that Auri-el, king of the Aldmer, ascended to Aetherius in full observance of his followers so that they may learn the methods of such apotheosis, we have the ideal of Alaxon, that is, the seeking of perfection. As I mentioned before, an early rift in Aldmeri society was the transition from the old ways of ancestor worship to what the Altmer currently practice, which is a highly selective form of ancestor worship focused only on their betters or more glorious members of society. Chiefly, we have what are considered the divines, Auri-el, Sirabane, Trinamax, Xarxes, and so on. The path to Alaxon is the pursuit of perfection that every high elf should strive towards in whatever their pursuit may be, whether that be with artistic endeavors, military prowess, or the mere display of correct etiquette. Baked in with this kind of sentiment, there are also some eugenic-minded practices, a correct breeding to perfection, mingling only the greatest and select bloodlines for their higher castes. This incredible focus on order and perfection, I believe, fundamentally is entwined with their desire for the divine, for Aetherius, for unity with Anu, the ineffable light, infinity. Remember, in conventional Altmeri theology, the Elves believed they were sundered from their states as divine spirits by the trickster that is Lorkhan, and hence plenty of their cultural attitudes and philosophical underpinnings contain a kind of striving for the divine, a search for perfection, an attempt to align themselves so greatly with the divine pursuits that they in themselves become divine once more. Arguably, this is the process of apotheosis they seek, to follow Auri-el like Sirabane or Finaster, escaping from mortality and ascending to the heavens. It's interesting to note that in Alinor, the gods are often spoken about as a divine body. Hear now the lesson of the divine body. The body of the divine wills us into being. Venerate the gods as one, for we are one with the gods. The Altmer believe that they were descended from gods, the Daedra, their ancestors, and hence their spirituality is built around a pursuit of unity. Such ideas can be found within the concept of Aldmeris itself. Aldmeris is believed to have been a great continent of elven kind before it was sundered by Lorkhan and his armies of man in wars at the dawn. Some scholars insist that it's a real place, some far-off continent. Others cite Aldmeris as Old Elnefe, a giant Pangea-like landmass that once encompassed Tamriel before it was shattered by the wars, and others hold Aldmeris as a metaphorical concept of unity amongst elven kind. Regardless of the truth of the matter, philosophically it concludes again this concept of a whole, a unity, fractured, sundered, and separated, with reunification being the desired outcome. If we were to project some kind of ideal state for the Altmer, it would be that all of Elvenkind is reunified with Auri-el, who himself is reunited with Anu, the eternal, the divine, without the limitations of the mundane world. Now, with this mentality regarding unity and perfection, you can understand that tradition and conformity are paramount values within Altmeri society, and you can witness this in all of their sentiments. Chaos offends them. For the Altmer, there is sacredness in all things, and sacred things must be done correctly. Remember the pursuit of Alaxon. Listen to this source here, a philosopher's contemplation on their sacred numbers. As I sit here in the perfection of this garden, I contemplate the sacred numbers that we recognize as auspicious and critical to the existence of the universe. 3 is the number of the prime celestials, as embodied in the sun and the 2 moons. It is also the number of my perfect daughters, which is why we shall produce no other heirs. 5 is the number of the elements, for reality consists of earth, air, water, fire, and ether. It is also the number of books I have open upon my desk at any given time. 8 is the number of the planets, as well as the sum of 3 plus 5. 8 is also the limit I impose when drinking glasses of gossamer tawny port with the members of my philosophical society. No more, no less. These are the good numbers, and the sum of the good numbers, which we call 16, is a very powerful number indeed. We must beware the bad number though, for 2 lacks vision and attempts to display duality, which we all know is impossible. The Altmer have their own system of astrological and numerical significance, but I think one of the most important takeaways here is that they consider the bad number, that is 2, which this philosopher says lacks vision and attempts to display duality, which to the Altmeri mindset is impossible. Remember, in the Altmeri creation story, Sithis and the soul of that concept, which is Lorkhan, represents limitation, a limitation on the eternal, on the divine, on the infinite light of Anu. It is a denial of unity placed upon the eternal and infinite. Fundamentally, the Altmer dislike the idea of duality. They call it impossible. As we know theologically, the Altmer have an explicit desire for a divine unity with a divine body of God. They are fractured and constrained in the prison of Mundus, and hence their theology is based around a striving back to the divine. If you'll allow me this one tangent, you might find it interesting that the inspirations behind the Altmeri religion and philosophy is largely found in real world Gnosticism. Gnosticism is kind of an anachronistic term, meaning that the people that we mark out who are a part of these belief systems wouldn't have called themselves Gnostics. Gnosticism more or less encompasses a range of early diverse philosophical and religious schools of thought, several of which incorporated and overlapped with Christian beliefs, spawning sects such as the Arians and Valentinians, which occurred before the more central Christian orthodoxy was established throughout the centuries, which was then formalized and unified in the First Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. There is so much nuance and scholarly debate about these Gnostic groups, many of whom would have considered themselves Christian, and even what we call Gnostic groups disagreed about certain aspects of their beliefs. But to focus on one that perhaps illustrates the Altmeri inspiration more clearly, we can look at the Valentinian system, which essentially proposes that there was once a pleroma, a fullness, and at its center was the primal father, or Bythos, the beginning of all things. In the Elder Scrolls equivalent, we would have Anu and Auri-el. From Bythos emanated the 30 Aeons, each in a sexually complementary pair, which in the Elder Scrolls equivalent world we would have the Et Arda, the original spirits that come forth. One of the youngest Aeons, named Sophia, tries to emulate her father by producing offspring without the assistance of her male pair, and then basically, without getting into the weeds of ancient cosmologies, ends up creating an abomination of sorts. She becomes the mother of the Demiurge, who creates and lords over the material world that we live in. The Demiurge is identified with the God of the Old Testament, and this cosmology attempts to explain the change of character that the Christian conception of God seems to have between the Old Testament and the New Testament. These Gnostics typically held some idea of Jesus as a divine instrument, an emanation, or a son to enlighten people back to the path, to the pleroma, the fullness, the real world of the spirit, not the false world of the material in which we live. I urge you, if you're interested, to investigate this more fully for more details, and there are a lot, but I tried to give the most bare-bones basic idea without all of the intricacy to illustrate the similarities between this ancient belief system and the Altmeri view of the Orbis. Lorkhan is most clearly comparable to the Demiurge and perhaps Sophia as Sithis. The Altmer are very much like Gnostics in the sense that they recognize the deformed and mutant aspects of the material world, and they know Lorkhan, the Demiurge, as an oppositional figure which bars them from unity with Anu, the fullness, like the Pleroma. It is most certainly not an exact one-to-one replication of the Valentinian system or other dubbed Gnostic belief systems, but there is lots of inspiration there. Common to a lot of these Gnostic beliefs were a distaste for the material world, and the same could be said of the Altmer. All the Altmeri endeavors seem an attempt to mimic the divine, to seek perfection, to follow the path of Alaxon in order to reach closer for unity with it. And this is where we come to man. Where these elves could be seen as the Gnostics, the belief systems of man could more broadly be seen as the Catholics or Orthodox in this equivalence, where creation is a revered thing and the material world of flesh is seen as a sacred creation, where the Altmer see Lorkhan or Gnostics see the Demiurge as a false god, a mutant, an abomination, decrying the world of the material as a limit on the true reality of Anu or the Pleroma. The races of man have a love for duality of spirit and body, the material. The gods are loved by man for their creation of both. This is why the Altmer view 2 as a bad number, because it lacks vision and attempts to display duality, which is impossible. I hope I haven't complicated it too much by drawing real-world equivalencies, but I find that they often enrich my own understandings. But I'll stick more firmly to the Elder Scrolls itself from this point onwards. You could imagine the Altmeri view of man in this context as tools to propagate the notions of Lorkhan, the positive view of creation, this enfleshed prison of suffering. In some of the more esoteric in-game canon texts, which also happen to have been written by Michael Kirkbride, most specifically the 36 Lessons of Vivek and the Mythic Dawn commentaries, we have mankind described in terms that reinforce such a view of man. From the 36 Lessons of Vivek, Sermon 13. The Temporal Myth is man. And from the Mythic Dawn commentaries, Volume 3, the bones of the wheel need their flesh, and that is mankind's heirloom. The bones of the wheel is a reference to the earth bones, the spirits, gods that sacrificed their power to stabilize creation and become the natural laws of Mundus. Ifri is the most renowned. Mankind is dubbed the flesh of the wheel. They are the mortals which reinforce the wheel through both action and belief. They drive the wheel in a linear fashion, cycle after cycle. Perhaps this is why they are considered the temporal myth. They are born and die and again through their action and beliefs of the world reinforce the false realm that is Mundus, that is, according to Altmeri belief. I know all this can get a little bit heady, but I promise that front-loading all of this discussion and information is critical to understanding the Thalmor and of course some of the more outlandish theories and conclusions that can be made about them. But let's for a moment ground our conversation here with the rise of the Thalmor as we know them today. The Third Era ends with the Oblivion Crisis, the events of the game Oblivion. The last of the Septim heirs sacrifices himself and the Amulet of Kings to become an avatar of Akatosh and defeat Mehrunes Dagon and his invasion of Nirn. This destabilized the Empire beyond repair, and what followed in the Fourth Era was a slow crumbling. Although it is not well known, Somerset Isle suffered from the Oblivion Crisis as much as Cyrodiil did. The Elves made war upon the Oblivion invaders, occasionally even crossing over to close down Oblivion gates. As a nation, they had more successes than Cyrodiil did, though the limitless Daedric hordes made the outcome a foregone conclusion. The Thalmor had always been a powerful faction within Somerset Isle, but had also always been a minority voice. During the crisis, the Crystal Tower was forced to give the Thalmor greater power and authority. Their efforts almost certainly saved Somerset Isle from being overrun. They capitalized on their success to seize total control in year 22 of the Fourth Era. They renamed the nation Alinor, which harkens back to an earlier age before the ascendancy of man. Most people outside the Aldmeri Dominion still call it Somerset Isle, either out of peevishness or ignorance. In year 29 of the Fourth Era, the government of Valenwood was overthrown by Thalmor collaborators and a union with Alinor proclaimed. It appears that Thalmor agents had formed close ties to certain Bosmeri factions even before the Oblivion Crisis. The Empire and its Bosmer allies, caught completely off guard, were quickly defeated by the much better prepared Altmer forces that invaded Valenwood on the heels of the coup. Thus was the Aldmeri Dominion reborn. Shortly afterward, the Aldmeri Dominion severed all contact with the Empire. For 70 years they were silent. Most scholars believe there was some kind of internal strife in Alinor, but very little is known of the factional struggles that went on inside the Dominion while the Thalmor consolidated its power in Somerset and Valenwood. By year 115 of the Fourth Era, the Thalmor had also brought the Khajiit into the fold, with the Elsewhere Confederacy dissolved, and the two ancient kingdoms of Anaquina and Palatine made client states of the Dominion. The third Aldmeri Dominion had become a strength on par with the first Aldmeri Dominion founded by Queen Ayrenn, yet with a far more radical approach to their philosophy of Elven superiority. On the 30th of Frostfall, year 171 of the Fourth Era, the Aldmeri Dominion sent an ambassador to the Imperial City with a gift in a covered cart and an ultimatum for the new Emperor. The long list of demands included staggering tributes, disbandment of the Blades, outlawing the worship of Talos, and ceding large sections of Hammerfell to the Dominion. Despite the warnings of his generals of the Empire's military weakness, Emperor Titus Mede II rejected the ultimatum. The Thalmor ambassador upended the cart, spilling over 100 heads on the floor, every Blades agent in Somerset and Valenwood. And so began the Great War, which would consume the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion for the next 5 years. The specific victories and defeats of the Great War are not essential to our discussion of the stranger parts of the Thalmor lore. However, what is vital to understand is that the Aldmeri Dominion were winning, and thanks to the Emperor's victory at the Battle of the Red Ring, the Empire was able to call a truce and bring a period of peace for the Empire, a time of rebuilding. The treaty was called the White-Gold Concordat, and one of the central and most contested parts of the agreement was regarding the theological position of Talos. The propaganda of imperial liaisons to the Aldmeri Dominion, such as the following text, The Talos Mistake, explains their decision to agree with the ban of Talos worship as a theologically motivated decision rather than a political capitulation. But when Tiber Septim passed to Aetherius, there came to be a ninth divine, Talos, also called Ysmir, the Dragon of the North. The man who was so loved in life became worshipped in death. Indeed, it can be argued that Talos, the ninth divine, became even more important than the 8 that had preceded him, at least to humans. For he was a god who was once just a man, and through great deeds actually managed to ascend to godhood. And if one human could achieve such a feat, couldn't it be done again? Couldn't all humans aspire to achieve divinity? So we thought, we humans. And so we continued to worship Talos and revere him as the ultimate hero god. But that was then. This is now. And now we know the truth. We were wrong. As citizens of the Empire, we all experienced the horrors of the Great War, and it was not until the signing of the White-Gold Concordat, the treaty between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, that we once again knew peace. One of the most important stipulations of that treaty, as every Imperial citizen is well aware, is that Talos can no longer be worshipped as a god. This edict shook the very foundations of the Empire. There were those who rebelled against the law. Indeed, some still do. But the citizens of the Empire must know this. The Emperor did not agree to outlaw the worship of Talos because it was demanded by the Thalmor, the ruling body of the Aldmeri Dominion. The Emperor agreed to the outlaw of the worship of Talos because it was the right thing to do. Today, the Emperor, and indeed the Empire itself, recognizes that allowing the worship of Talos was a mistake, for by doing so, by allowing the worship of Talos as a divine, the Empire actually did its people a great disservice, for this only succeeded in weakening the memory of the man, Tiber Septim, and his many extraordinary, though mortal, deeds, and pushing people away from the 8 divines, the true gods, who deserve our love and reverence. Of course, this is pure propaganda for the sake of political stability. Hardly anyone accepts this as truth, and the ban of Talos worship remains one of the most divisive aspects of the White-Gold Concordat. Further still, due to the Markarth incident, the Thalmor are also allowed to have justiciars operating within Imperial territory, and they are given jurisdiction to root out and hunt Talos worshippers. I'd encourage you to watch our video on the Civil War linked in the description for more of an explanation regarding the Markarth incident and that whole situation, but in general, for a Talos worshipper in the year 201 of the Fourth Era, the situation is grim. At the beginning of this video, I spoke about key differences between man and elf, specifically their biological differences regarding age, and also their more stable cultures of long heritage stretching back thousands of years with few changes, as opposed to the violent fluctuations of man. Well, within all of this is a central thread that winds itself into a long tapestry of conspiracy and ancient grudges. Who exactly is pulling the strings behind the Thalmor. We could only engage in wild speculation, but more than likely there is some kind of elite cabal of long-lived elves involved in this elaborate orchestra, and it is elaborate. We must understand that fundamentally the Thalmor as it is today is a response, a reprisal centuries in the making. It is critical that we understand the Thalmor as a radical political group, particularly in their most contemporary incarnation, even among the elves of Somerset. Ironically, toward the end of the Third Era, there was an aggravated youth, but not in the way that you would think. Listen to these quotes from the Third Pocket Guide to the Empire, which is contemporary with the end of the Third Era. For thousands of years, the Altmer have implicitly believed in their superiority to all other races and cultures in Tamriel. For much of this time, they may have been right, but after the incorporation of Somerset into the Empire, doubts began to creep in. With the insularity of the Somerset decisively broken, many Altmer, particularly the young, which among the High Elves is a fairly loose term, began to take a more critical view of the rigid hierarchy of Altmer society and its strict cultural xenophobia. While there had always been discontent on the fringes of Altmer society, which was traditionally resolved by exile of the malcontents, for the first time a significant element of Altmer began to agitate for social change. This nascent revolution in the Somerset Isle has taken many forms. Most constructive, surely, is the acceptance of new cultures and races onto its shores, some occupying positions that would have been forbidden just a century ago. The Queen of Firsthold, for example, is the Dunmer Morgaya, daughter of Baron Zaya and sister of the King of Morrowind, Helseth. Her children, Goranthir and Rinala, though half Altmer, are fully Dunmer in appearance and stand to inherit the throne. A darker side of this movement, however, is exhibited by a shadowy group who call themselves the Beautiful. Originally a salon for artists, with the reasonable philosophy that Somerset must let go of its past in order to move forward, the Beautiful became a revolutionary gang dedicated to the destruction of the greatest monuments of Altmer civilization. The Crystal Tower was naturally an early target, and fortunately attempts against it have failed, but many other great ancient sculptures and emblems of the past have been vandalized. Lately, the Beautiful have turned their attention to living symbols of the Isle, the royalty of Somerset. The particularly gruesome murder of the daughter of the King of Shimmerine has horrified and outraged the public. Finally, some of Somerset's youth are rebelling against their present, ironically by embracing their past. The Imperial Geographical Society is not allowed to visit the Isle of Artaeum to survey and document it, but there is little doubt that the Psijjic Order is increasingly popular among the young and is willing to exploit this. Over the past 1,000 years, only 17 new initiates were brought into the Order. In the past 2 years, however, another 30 have joined. 30 new members of an order may not be enough to be considered a surprising trend in most circles, but to the tradition-bound grey cloaks of Artaeum, it raises many questions. What the Psijjic's aim in this recent recruitment, however, is anyone's guess at this time. There is a whole bunch to unpack here, and we'll be diving deeper into the Psijjic Order later in the video, particularly regarding their role in opposition to the Thalmor, but the political instability of Somerset at this time is quite fascinating, considering we know the outcome of the future. You had big pushes from the youth for a reinvention of Somerset, with foreigners in positions of power and the embracing of new cultures, and we had this shadowy group called the Beautiful, who sought to destroy the Crystal Tower, vandalizing and even murdering in order to shed Somerset of its ancient constraints of tradition. I find it particularly intriguing that this group was interested in the destruction of the Crystal Tower, an eventuality that occurred, however not by their hands, as far as we know. We could even speculate that perhaps within the revolutionary group dubbed the Beautiful, there were members of the Thalmor orchestrating the conditions for a radical overthrow of government. This kind of pattern is not unseen in our own history, with revolutionary movements creating the crises and instability that allow for the rise of authoritarian regimes in their wake. For example, the French Revolution, followed by the rise of Napoleon. While a direct connection between the actions of the anti-tradition, the Beautiful, and the Thalmor are vague, if at all existing, the reality is that during the Oblivion Crisis, wherein thousands of Daedra poured forth from Oblivion in Mehrunes Dagon's invasion of Tamriel, the Crystal Tower fell, and the Thalmor rose to power afterwards. From the book Rising Threat, written by an Altmeri refugee named Lathanil of Sunhold. What happened after the Tower of Crystal-like Law fell was a daze. It was as if my mind simply stopped. Instinct took over, as my every thought sank into a black abyss of despair. Time lost all meaning, and to this day I know not how long I was in this state. Eventually, a conscious thought managed to break my fugue. The Daedric horde had vanished, gone as suddenly as they had come. Before my numbed mind could comprehend the tumult that consumed my beloved Somerset Isle, before I could formulate the question, how, they were there, dripping honeyed poison in our ears. The Thalmor. They were the ones that saved us, they claimed, working deep in subtle magics. It was their efforts, their sacrifices that delivered the Ultima from extinction. Oh, what fools we were. We wanted so desperately someone to thank for ending our tribulations. We lavished it upon the first to step up and claim the glory. With that simple act of gratitude, we allowed a vile rot to seep into our homeland, to putrefy our once noble and distinguished civilization. It was months before I began to suspect the error we had made. Small twinges of unease would vex me, but each one alone was easy enough to disregard and push aside. The exile of the great seer mage, Rinador, the Bold, was the final doubt that I could not ignore. You see, Rinador was one of the very few who survived the collapse of the Crystal Tower. I saw some of his bravery and heroics with my own eyes. It was his leadership and sorcery that made the Daedra pay such a high price for their destruction of the Crystal Tower. The Thalmor besmirched his name when he had the audacity to publicly doubt and question their role in ending the Oblivion Crisis on Somerset Isle. Rinador made the mistake of ignoring the consensus gentium, trusting instead to logic and facts. The shrewdness of the Thalmor, however, was not such to allow something as trivial as the truth stand in their way. As soon as they shifted the collective opinion ever so slightly against Rinador, they had him sequestered and intensified their efforts to tarnish his reputation. Unable to mount any sort of defense to the Thalmor's attacks, Rinador was quickly denounced and exiled. The volumes of Rising Threat continue to explain the Thalmor as a nefarious force, playing the long game, destabilizing the Empire with the assassination of Potentate Okato, causing the Stormcrown interregnum, and a violent overhaul of the Somerset Isles. With the Empire submerged in this mayhem, the Thalmor were quick to act. They overthrew the rightful kings and queens of the Ultima. I remember the revulsion and horror that took hold when word reached me that this dementia had gripped my homeland. Once so proud and majestic, many of our great race actually embraced this insanity. Then, the first of many pogroms descended on Somerset Isle. They slaughtered any who were not of the blood of the Aldmeri, a fine excuse to purge the dissidents as well. The Thalmor have never been ones to waste such an opportunity. From the outside, what we can understand of the Thalmor regime is that there are no longer kings and queens, and I can imagine much of the traditional hierarchical structures of the Altmeri are gone, including the Sapiarchs, who were a powerful order of sages and scholars, both keepers of the Crystal Tower, which is now destroyed, and trainers of the heirs to the throne, as well as chief advisors. It is reasonable to assume that this institution has vanished. The Thalmor have brought a radical recorrection, asserting Altmeri purity and superiority as its foremost tenets, with dissent punishable by elimination. As I said, we don't have an exact breakdown of Thalmor governance, with most of our direct exposure involving emissaries and justiciars. I personally imagine some kind of fascist council kind of structure, perhaps with a chancellor or something, but I don't imagine any kind of democratic element here. We also know that they still have noble titles of a kind, though this may not entail the same roles as in previous regimes. For example, in the Great War we have record of a Lord Narafin and a Lady Ayrenn as leading generals of the Dominion forces. In essence, the Thalmor that orchestrated the inception of the Third Aldmeri Dominion are a government promoting racial purity and superiority, a remix on ancient long-held ideas by the Ultima, but able to be acted upon without the perhaps rigid and stagnant culture that existed in the days of the monarchy. Again, we can only really fill in the gaps since we have so little information to go off. It is also important to reiterate that the Aldmeri Dominion were the aggressors of the Great War, and presumably, if not for the victories of the Empire that could purchase a stalemate of a sort, the Dominion would have expanded and taken all of Tamriel. Do not forget, ever since the days of Queen Ayrenn in the mid-Second Era, greater interventionist attitudes had burgeoned among the Ultima compared to their previously monolithic attitudes of isolationism. The Thalmor of today are just the extreme version of the same sentiment, but instead of viewing the races of man as young children, they are viewed more as insects to be wiped out At least this is the vibe that you pick up from most of the Thalmor individuals that you come into contact with in the games. With a comprehensive understanding of the Thalmor, all facets of their creation, the centuries-long journey to their current ideological form, we can see how the idea of Talos is grossly abhorrent to them, and hence they seek to expunge him from the mythos. There are several interesting theories, based partly on in-game evidence and then expanded with out-of-game additions by Michael Kirkbride, a former developer and consultant, but I'll do my best to lay out the evidences separately, indicating which has canon basis and what is largely conjecture. Firstly, let's just zero in on the Talos issue itself first, then we can get to some of the more abstract Towers stuff going on. There is the idea that Talos is the new Lorkhan. Again, we are going to be diving into the realms of the contradictory and mythological, but in a broad sense, the Nordic and Altmeri view of things both recognize a sort of war at the dawn of the world, one which has the Elven gods versus the gods of man. So on one side, you'd have Shor, called Lorkhan by the Elves, as the leader of man, along with gods like Kyne, Dibella, or Sturn, fighting the Aldmeri gods, led by Auri-el, Trinimac, and so on. The end result is that Lorkhan or Shor is defeated. His heart is ripped out and shot into the ocean and hidden, when it is found out that it cannot be destroyed. Even within the Nordic belief system, Shor is considered a dead god, killed by the Elven gods, and hence that is why he rules Sovngarde, the afterlife. In ancient Nedic systems of belief, Needs being the ancestors of modern-day Imperials, they recognized the same Lorkhan Shor figure as Shezarr, known as the spirit behind all human undertaking. This is where we get the term Shezarrine. The myths of Shor's campaigns to claim a place for men in Atmora are well known to scholars, but less well known are Shor's deeds in Tamriel afterward. A careful examination of Nedic oral traditions, documented haphazardly in the oldest imperial texts, traces the outlines of a fascinating, if mostly forgotten tale. In the Middle Merethic era, the Mer who would become the Ayleids left Somerset to carve out new realms for themselves in Tamriel. More advanced in both war-making and the uses of magicka than the Nedic peoples who already lived there, at first they easily subjugated or drove away their new neighbours, but slowly the divided Needs began to resist the Ayleid advances. Time and again in Nedic folklore, a stranger arrives to help ancient men. This stranger comes as a teacher, an advisor, and a maker of alliances between tribes who otherwise would have fought alone. He is not a warrior ruler like Shor, but instead a figure who inspires others to fight for themselves. A Dothraki legend mentions Shezarr, who stole stoneworking from the Dwemer and taught Zinfara to call Nerncrux from the mountain roots. A Perenna tale claims that the Cult of Stars learned soul magic from a white-bearded stranger. Likewise, Shezarr of the Snowy Beard is said to give the secrets of Ayleid battle magic to the Needs of Cirid, showing them how to turn their enemies' arts against them. And most fascinating of all, a stone tablet, said to have been found in the ruins of Sador, depicts a bearded figure as the Shezarrine, Shor who lives, teacher of men. Taken together, it seems these disparate tales show that Shezarr inspired many different tribes to resist Ayleid oppression, yet the later Nedic sagas do not mention the wise stranger. Whatever part Shezarr, or Shor, in the guise of a teacher instead of a warrior, played in those days, came to an end in the middle of the Merethic era. But the ember of hope he gave to ancient men sustained them through centuries of enslavement by the Ayleid Empire, until it at last blazed once again to inspire Saint Alicia's rebellion. The central idea is that these Shezarrines are essentially avatars, echoes or reincarnated fragments of the dead god Shezarr, otherwise known as Shor or Lorkhan. In the Songs of Pelennor, there is speculation that Pelennor Whitestrake is one such example of a Shezarrine. It is a solid truth that Morahouse was the son of Kyne, but whether or not Pelennor was indeed the Shezarrine is best left unsaid. For once, Plontinu, who favoured the short sword, said it, and that night he was smothered by moths. It is famous, though, that the two talked of each other as family, with Morahouse as the lesser, and that Pelennor loved him and called him nephew. But these could be merely the fancies of immortals. In the book Before the Ages of Man, there is another reference to the kind of wandering stranger hero championing man, alluding to this Shezarrine concept. Also, during the late Merethic era, the legendary immortal hero, warrior, sorcerer, and king variously known as Pellinor Whitestrake, Harold Hairy Breeks, Ismir, Hans the Fox, etc., wandered Tamriel, gathering armies, conquering lands, ruling, then abandoning his kingdoms to wander again. There are additional references in the lore speaking of a similar idea, such as in the folktales of the Reachmen, saying that Lork, their version of Lorkhan, still walks among mortals and appears to help the Reachmen when in times of desperate need. Or in Khajiit mythology, Lorkhaj was supposedly cursed to walk Nirn for many phases. All of these sources in totality bring enough evidence for this Shezarrine as a concept, the idea that mythic echoes or avatars of the missing god or dead god, variously named Shor, Lorkhan, Shezarr, and so on, returns to champion the causes of man and assure that they do not succumb to the Elves. Naturally, many of the proposed Shezarrines are Merethic era or early First Era heroes fighting to remove the dominance of Elves. Now, admittedly, we start to get into heavier speculation territory from this point onward. We also have to deal with several competing stories about the appearance of Talos, but let's lay it all out for fun. There, of course, is the conventional idea that Talos is Tiber Septim, ascended to godhood by being super epic and loved by the gods. But then there is the Arcturian heresy, which involves far more foul play, including the Numidium, the Mantella, and all kinds of Oversoul quackery. This, at least in my head, gets a few more brownie points because of the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall plotline is deeply involved with these concepts, but I really don't want to get stuck in the weeds with this, so I'd encourage you to look at our other videos regarding Talos specifically for a longer explanation. But there is a fan idea, largely based on posts by Kirkbride and fan speculations, that posit Hjalti Earlybeard, later known as Tiber Septim, Zurin Arctis, and Ismir Wulfarth as three Shezarrines who were through Hjalti's plotting combined into a kind of oversoul which we call Talos. The idea of having a new god being created out of several fragments of Lorkhan, those being the Shezarrines. Hence Talos is presented as a kind of rebirthed Lorkhanic being. And perhaps this adds as to why the Thalmor are so opposed to him, not wanting Lorkhan, a devil-like figure in their belief, to be reborn. It's all very loose and largely sourced from outside speculations and fan theories, still very entertaining though. Just to reiterate, the concept of a Shezarrine is very much canon, but quite often the specifics of who exactly were Shezarrines and whether Talos is some Oversoul Shezarrine combo is disputable. However, thematically it remains a very cool idea. If this were known by the Thalmor, or at least the upper echelons, or founders or whatever, imagine their perspective. Talos being the deification of Tiber Septim, who conquered Alinor for the first time and made a mockery of their race, unleashing the Numidium upon their shores, this would already be a problem. But then if it were true that this Talos deity is some sort of mythic reincarnation of Lorkhan, just think of the shame of it for the Elves. You can see why they would be so opposed. If we too pull in the ideas of man as the Temporal Myth, who so love the false world of Lorkhan, we can see how desperate the Thalmor would be to oppose any pro-human deity in the mythic landscape, lest they continually reinforce a world of man's dominance, further making solid the realities of flesh and severance from the divine. I will quote a writing from Michael Kirkbride from 2008, an Altmeri commentary on Talos. To kill man is to reach heaven, from where we came before the doom drum's iniquity. When we accomplish this, we can escape the mockery and long shame of the material prison. To achieve this goal, we must 1. Erase the upstart Talos from the mythic. His presence fortifies the wheel of the convention and binds our souls to this plane. 2. Remove man not just from the world, but from the pattern of possibility, so that the very idea of them can be forgotten and thereby never again repeated. 3. With Talos and the sons of Talos removed, the dragon will become ours to unbind. The world of mortals will be over. The dragon will uncoil his hold on the stagnancy of linear time and move as free serpent again, moving through the ether without measure or burden, spilling time along the innumerable roads we once travelled, and with that we will regain the mantle of the imperishable spirit. This writing, while outside of the canon sources, does provide an insightful rationale into the anti-Talos, anti-mankind perspective, and ultimately sums up an ideal theological end state of the Altmer, while also providing context to the steps of the Thalmor and the Third Aldmeri Dominion. But now we can segue into the Towers stuff. The Thalmor Towers theory is by far one of the most popular theories about the Thalmor's endgame plan for the world. To be clear, there is the assumed idea that the majority of the Thalmor are just straight up Elven supremacists who want to expand their dominion and their right to rule over everything. However, if the following theory has any weight, then there is an idea that the upper echelons or rulership cabals of the Thalmor desire to make Mundus metaphysically unstable so they can return to the eternal affinity of Anu, so they can undo the mortal prison that Lorkhan created. For anime fans out there, the short of the idea is that the Thalmor essentially want the outcome of the Human Instrumentality Project in Neon Genesis Evangelion.
The power to unmake the world at my fingertips. And you think you can do anything about it? You think I don't know what you're up to? You think I can't destroy you?
The quote you just heard was from Ancano, the Thalmor agent during the College of Winterhold questline, who at the time had just co-opted the power of the Eye of Magnus, an artifact with which seemingly he intended to use for nefarious purposes, including perhaps, as he said, to unmake the world. Now, this is not to say this reinforces the rather elaborate Towers theory of the Thalmor, however, it does perhaps speak to the intent or the idea that unmaking the world would somehow be a good thing. Remember, from a theological perspective, the Ultima view themselves as fallen beings, once noble spirits entrapped in a world of flesh and suffering by the vile trickster Lorkhan. Apotheosis, like Auri-el managed, and many of their other ancestors, is the desirable state, a reunification with Anu through transcendence. However, from one perspective, another way of achieving that difficult goal, the Thalmor could approach the situation differently. Instead of trying to transcend mortality and work your way back to Aetherius, instead you could try and unmake material reality itself, to undo the mortal project. This is the idea that is at the center of the Towers theory. Of course, you can state an end goal, one that, mind you, also aligns with their long-held theological beliefs about the condition of Mundus, but how do you go about it? That's the question. Perhaps one such way was through the actions of Ancano, someone who wanted the Eye of Magnus, a great artifact of power, quite literally the Eye of Magnus, who was the architect of Mundus, and presumably with this, he and by extension the Thalmor might have used it to such an end. Really, it is just Ancano's one quote about the power to unmake the world, but it does seem rather specific. Also, we have the Psijjic Order monks working with you as the player character to thwart such ends, but we can get into that in a little bit. At the core of the Towers theory, of course, are the towers themselves. There are in fact canon sources that speak of the metaphysical properties of certain towers and great structures, both natural and constructed, that somehow have reality-affecting properties. This all began with the very first tower, the adamantine tower that was constructed by the gods at Convention, otherwise known as Adamantia. I shall read from this source, Orbic Enigma. The spike of Adamantia and its zero stone dictated the structure of reality in its orbic vicinity, defining for the Earthbones their story or nature within the unfolding of the dragon's time-bound tale. The Aldmeri or Merethic Elves were singular of purpose only so long as it took them to realize that other towers, with their own stones, could tell different stories, each following rules inscribed by variorum architects. And so the Mer self-refracted, each to their own creation, the Chimer following Redheart, the Bosma burgeoning green sap, the Ultima erecting crystal-like lore, et alia. But of all the prismatic Mer, none were more presumptuous than the Ayleids of the Heartland. They built their tower in open emulation of Adamantia, using as founding stone the great red diamond they had uncovered, Kim El Adabal, said to be crystallized blood from the heart of Lorkhan itself. For the heart on its arrow passed over the Heartlands, birthing one of the postonymic quaternary meanings. Thus did White Gold become Tower 1, as we all know. As foretold by the moth-eyed, Ayleid hubris was to bear bitter fruit. With their vision on high to behold the overworlds, they failed to note the seething needlings at their feet until the thralls rose up and took their tower away from them. Kim El Adabal they took as well, but not before the Archmage Anumeril fangled an eightfold staff of towers, each segment a semblance of a tower in its dance, and then 7 of these segments were borne by white gold knights to distant fold places where they were hidden. This was all unknown to Pelinolicia, be certain, or there might have been different 8 divines. Staff of Towers and intricacies aside, the central thesis of the Thalmor Tower plot is that there are, or were in total, 8 of these towers, which are more or less the linchpins for the material reality of Mundus, 8 spokes of the wheel, perhaps. Each tower corresponds to a stone, and if somehow each of these stones, towers, were destroyed or deactivated, well, then the mortal plane that is Mundus would be subject to dissolution, and through this proposed Thalmor lens, this would be a fulfillment of their theological goal, a return to spirit. According to the book The Staff of the Towers, which is an Elysian-era writing on the powerful staff and its relationship to the mythical towers, these are the following: adamantine, primordial and solemn; red, brooding and blood-soaked; crystal, profane and inscrutable; orichalc, silent and forgotten; snowthroat, cold and forbidding; greensap, vibrant and wise; brass, striding and powerful; white gold, boundless and eternal. I want to assert here that we should all approach this theory with hands-bearing grains of salt, because there are shaky bits of the theory which require the sort of time-bending metaphysical quackery that makes all these layers of contradiction and retcon kind of make sense, but nonetheless, let's go over the tower's current status. Adamantine Tower, also known as the Durrani Tower, is upon the Isle of Balfiera in the middle of the Iliac Bay, where its stewards, the Durrani Elves, have been for millennia. It has supposedly been here since the gods made it at convention. As far as we know, it is intact and untarnished. Red Tower, alternatively known as Red Mountain, has gone boom. At the turn of the 4th era, with the disappearance of Vivec and the impact of Bardal, Red Mountain erupted, and there was a great destruction across the land of Morrowind. As the tower's theory would conclude, this tower is deactivated. The Crystal Tower, also known as Crystal-like Lore, was, as we have already discussed in this video, destroyed during the Daedric invasions of the Oblivion Crisis, and hence would be considered deactivated. However, I wonder if there was any conspiratorial jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams kind of rhetoric regarding its destruction. I find it interesting that the radical revolutionary group, the Beautiful, that were active at the end of the 3rd era, were trying to destroy the Crystal Tower, and we already discussed possible connections between the Thalmor and this group. What if the Thalmor somehow orchestrated or assisted in the Crystal Tower's destruction using the Oblivion Crisis as cover? If the Tower's theory is to be believed, then this would be in their interest regardless, but also from a more grounded perspective, the Thalmor have often used some kind of crisis as a catalyst to expand their power. The Thalmor took claim of closing the Oblivion Crisis on Somerset with their powerful magics, and this championed them to a position where they could eventually overthrow the monarchy, and later with the Khajiit they would supposedly use their magic to return the moons to the night sky during the Void Nights, the period where for 2 years the moons mysteriously disappeared. Who's to say the Thalmor didn't use those same magics to obscure them in the first place? Whether it is for some world-ending metaphysical reasons, or rather just political agenda advancing subterfuge reasons, I can buy into the idea that the Thalmor had a role in destroying the Crystal Tower or allowing it to be destroyed by the Daedra before saving everyone, considering that soon after they banished Rinador, the great seer mage who was one of the few to survive its destruction, especially when he questioned the Thalmor's role. We'll talk more Thalmor-Daedra connection in a bit, but for now, continuing with the towers. We have the Orichalc Tower, of which very little is known, except that it was on the now sunken Yakuda. In Yakudan mythology, Diagna, the Orichalc god of the sideways blade, crashed his fist against it, and swords fell from the walls of the Orichalc Tower like needles from a dry pine. It is said that Diagna brought the Orichalc weapons to the Yakudans to fight against the left-handed elves who once ruled that place. Either way, the Orichalc Tower is assumed to have been destroyed as Yakuda was sunken beneath the seas. Next we have Snowthroat, or the Snow Tower, which is thought to be the throat of the world, Mount Hrothgar. The source, Book of the Dragonborn, recites the prophecy which mentions a few of the towers. When Misril takes its place at the 8 corners of the world, when the Brass Tower walks and time is reshaped, when the thrice-blessed fail and the Red Tower trembles, when the Dragonborn ruler loses his throne and the White Tower falls, when the Snow Tower lies sundered, kingless, bleeding, the World Eater wakes and the wheel turns upon the last Dragonborn. The Snow Tower lies, sundered, kingless and bleeding. This phrase would imply to some extent that the Snow Tower is broken, metaphorically in connection with the state of Skyrim in a season unending of civil war. This could be taken to mean that as long as Skyrim is in such a broken state, then so is the tower metaphysically broken, which also provides some additional reasoning as to why the Thalmor behind the scenes would want the civil war to be ongoing between the Empire and the Stormcloaks, but then again there is sufficient reasoning as to why they would want this regardless without resorting to cracked conspiracies, but still food for thought. The next proposed tower is Greensap, which is an ancient elden tree, a type of grat oak grown from the stone, the perchance acorn. Much of the lore regarding this tower in particular comes from the Elder Scrolls Online regarding the Ayleid sorcerer Auri-el, creator of the Staff of Towers, but ultimately the fate of this tower is not known in the 4th era. However, with the Aldmeri Dominion expanded over Valenwood, if it was active in whatever metaphysical sense that is relevant, then I am sure the Thalmor would be figuring out how to destroy it, again if this theory is to be believed. Walkbrass, or Brass Tower, is in reference to the Numidium, which by this point in history is well and truly destroyed, having been used by Type Septim to conquer Alinor and cement his rule, and then again it was rebuilt and activated at the end of Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, resulting in the Miracle of Peace, otherwise known as the Warp in the West. Dragon breaks and all that happened, but the Numidium is toast, and so as a tower it is destroyed, I would think. We aren't going to get into the 5th era Coda Kirkbride stuff. And finally, White Gold, that is White-Gold Tower. When the Dragonborn ruler loses his throne and the White Tower falls. Metaphorically speaking, the White-Gold Tower is destroyed as its stone, the Amulet of Kings, was sacrificed as Martin Septim became an avatar of Akatosh in order to thwart Mehrunes Dagon. So with all that said, in total tally, we could only really say that the Adamantine Tower for certain is active and untouched, and perhaps if this whole Towers hold up reality approach is true, then it may remain the last tower to topple for the Thalmor's master plan. Now look, the metaphysical powers of the towers, or at least some of them, are made certain in several lore pieces and experiences in-game. For example, in the Somerset Isles chapter of the Elder Scrolls Online, the magical properties of the Crystal Tower are made abundantly clear as the triumvirate of Daedric princes attempts to use its power for nefarious ends, or we have the scholarly debates on the power of the White Gold to reflect the desired conditions of its ruling people. In reality, this seems a roundabout way to retcon why Cyrodiil wasn't a jungle before Type Septim, but all in all, there is some magical, mythical, metaphysical stuff going on with the towers, but their exact role in the holding up of Mundus's reality is not clear, and hence the entirety of the Thalmor Towers theory sits in very murky water, and ultimately, until Elder Scrolls 6, we won't really have any indication as to whether this is in any way legitimate. Personally, my interest in the Towers theory has waned throughout the years. I'm all on board for the conceptual end goal of a kind of denial of Lorkhan or Talos and a dissolution of the material world, so that the Ultima can achieve unity with the heavens and be free of suffering, but to me, personally, some of the specifics with the towers as scaffolding for the world can feel a little contrived. I still appreciate it as a fun idea, even if perhaps unnecessarily complicated. I much rather focus on the erase Talos from the Mythic, remove man from the pattern of possibility, the temporal myth is man kind of thing. So as this video has been about the Thalmor and more broadly the Altmeri perspective, I do want to highlight the fact that this is not some 100% factual rendition of the cosmology of the Orbrus, but rather the Altmeri perspective. Their supposed end goals could in fact be psychotic and perhaps not even grounded in any kind of realistic possibility. It could be far more complicated than they would think. We must consider again that the Altmeri culture and the philosophy and theology on which it stands is itself a proposed deviation from the old ways. That is the traditional spiritual system of the Aldmeri that first arrived on Somerset. This is the earliest of the schisms of the Somerset Isles. The religion of the people also changed because of this change in society. No longer did the Aldmeri worship their own ancestors, but the ancestors of their betters. Auri-el, Trinimac, Sirabane, and Finastra are among the many ancestor spirits who became gods. A group of elders rebelled against this trend, calling themselves the Psijjics, the keepers of the old ways of Aldmeris. With their mystical powers, they were able to settle in Artaeum, away from what they considered the corruption of their society. They continued to return to the land to act as advisors, but never again would they call Somerset home. Altmeri society is fundamentally different to the original Aldmeri settlers and the Psijjics who continued their ways on the Isle of Artaeum. And so while Altmeri religion and culture has a pedigree dating back beyond recorded history, it is not infallible and has its detractors. Of course, this being the Elder Scrolls lore, there is seemingly much contradiction or simultaneous mythologies operating at the same time layered over one another, with similarities for sure, but it seems to be hard to pin down an objective truth, only the greater and lesser supported ideas. But instead of contrasting every single cultural mythology, I think it might be more enlightening to highlight the spiritual beliefs of the Psijjic order and see in what ways Altmeri society may have skewed its perspective throughout the millennia. Interestingly, the Psijjic beliefs, the old ways as they are called, believe that all mortals are descended from the Arcarii. the very first spirits in existence, the distant ancestors of the traditionally worshipped gods Aidra and Daedra. The Psijjics are known to have a complex system of ancestor worship which proposes a different view of metaphysical reality. What, after all, is the origin of these spiritual forces that move the invisible strings of Mundus? Any neophyte of Artaeum knows that these spirits are our ancestors, and that, while living, they too were bewildered by the spirits of their ancestors, and so on back to the original Archaei. The Daedra and gods to whom the common people turn are no more than the spirits of superior men and women whose power and passion granted them great influence in the afterworld. Certainly this is our truth and our religion, but how does it help us in our sacred duty of Selefernse, or providing grave and faithful counsel to lesser men? Primarily, it is easy to grasp the necessity both of endowing good men with great power and making powerful men good. We recognize the multiple threats that a strong tyrant represents: breeds cruelty which feeds the Daedra Boethia, and hatred which feeds the Daedra Vaemina. If he should die having performed a particularly malevolent act, he may go to rule in oblivion, and worst of all, he inspires other villains to thirst after power and other rulers to embrace villainy. Knowing this, we have developed patience in our dealings with such despots. They should be crippled, humiliated, impoverished, imprisoned. Other counselors may advocate assassination or warfare, which, aside from its spiritual insignificance, is expensive and likely to inflict at least as much pain on the innocents as the brutish dictator. No, we are intelligence gatherers, dignified diplomats, not revolutionaries. How then are our counselors faithful? We are faithful only to the old ways. It is essential always to remember the spiritual world while keeping our eyes open in the physical one. Performing the rites of Maoita on the 2nd of Hearthfire and the Vigild on the 1st of Second Seed are essential means of empowering salutary spirits and debilitating unclean ones. How then are we at once faithful to those we counsel and to the Isle of Artaeum? Perhaps the sage Teherete said it best: in Mundus, conflict and disparity are what bring change, and change is the most sacred of the 11 forces. Change is the force without focus or origin. It is the duty of the disciplined Psijjic, enlightened one, to dilute change where it brings greed, gluttony, sloth, ignorance, prejudice, cruelty. Here Teherete lists the rest of the 111 prodigalities, and to encourage change where it brings excellence, beauty, happiness, and enlightenment. As such, the faithful council has but one master, his mind. If the man, the Psijjic council, acts wickedly and brings Ogenthir, bad change, and will otherwise not be counselled, it is the Psijjic's duty to counterbalance the Ogenthir by any means necessary. Emphasis mine. The source I just read, an explanation of Psijjic beliefs, contains a good amount of esoteric jargon, but nonetheless, we can pass out from this explanation the idea that there is in fact a duality, a sense of reality which includes both a spirit world or afterworld and a material world in which we live in. In this system of belief, they speak of the Daedra and gods as all ancestors, as in the sense that they were once superior men and women whose power and passion granted them influence in the afterworld. In a sense, they speak of a condition in which the sufficiently powerful in life, think Auri-el, king of the Aldmeri, or Tiber Septimus Talos, ascend to the afterworld, or the world of the spirit. Perhaps it is easier to envision this as the mythic landscape, and thereby they are able to influence the material world in a way which feeds their own pathos, whether that be to good or bad ends. Kellerus in his writing cites the example of the Daedra Boethia, who feeds from cruelty, or Vaemina, who feeds from hatred. Using this same logic, it would of course apply to the good actors who gain power and become powerful in the afterworld. The Psijjics use this complex and ritualized system of ancestor worship, remember all are ancestors in their view, in order to elevate the good by diluting change where it brings greed and cruelty. Their word for bad change is Ogenthir. I find this very interesting because it seems that unlike the Altmeri, the Psijjics believe in a sense of duality, a spirit and physical which feeds into one another. Man to myth, myth to maker, maker of man, man to myth. A sort of interrelated loop of the material and spirit worlds interacting throughout time. The ways of the Psijjic are esoteric and often unexplained in totality. They are incredibly powerful mages who deal with mysticism and time magic, knots and fractured alternate timeline echoes, all this kind of stuff. We start getting into multiverse type things with the Psijjic, but let's not tackle all that today. Perhaps another video. Overall, the point of highlighting this is that the Psijjic order does not share this same Altmeri sentiment of unity, as it seems. They do not seem to view the material world in the same way, nor are they as pro-stasis in their view of of the world. They believe in no everlasting infinite perfection, rather they know the world of change, and it is their responsibility to promote good change and dilute the bad. If the original Aldmeri, who first came to Somerset, and those before them believed in such a way, then we can see how the Altmeri belief system is not in fact the authoritative view of the world despite its antiquity. It, like many belief systems, emerge as a reinforcement of culture, and in their case, one that was trending towards hierarchy and conceptions of unity and conformity, a striving to alaxon, perfection. Whereas for the Psijjics, or the ancient Aldmeri old ways, which they continue, held no such conception of a perfection, because perfection implies stasis, an ideal state, of which there is none according to the Psijjics, who understand reality as a realm of change and flow between the spirit and the material. Belief system differences aside, we also see that the Psijjic Order is most certainly opposed to the Thalmor of the Third Aldmeri Dominion. Their Isle of Artaeum has disappeared, as it has done before, and in the College of Winterhold questline we see the tensions between the two groups on display.
All you need to know is that the Psijjic Order is a rogue organization, believing themselves to be above the law. They have clashed with the Aldmeri Dominion before, and I have no intention of allowing that to happen here.
What was their previous clash? Anything to do with the Crystal Tower, perhaps? Regardless, the Psijjic Order work with you to prevent the Thalmor's abuse of the Eye of Magnus, and they take it away for safekeeping. Considering the Psijjic Order work in opposition to the Thalmor, I am left to wonder why. Psijjics have long been advisors and respected sages on Somerset, many a time serving lords and kings, offering their counsel, seeking to bring about good change in the world, and guiding away from Ogenthir. Those very same kings and lords would have had all of those Altmeri beliefs about unity and alaxon. The point is, the Psijjics have differed in beliefs about the world for a long time, but the rise of the Thalmor specifically has caused a rift. Why and what exactly, we can't say for sure. However, there is one last topic to discuss, one that may portray the Thalmor as a far-fallen and malevolent group, one who may not even believe in the very rhetoric they peddle.
I understand Daedra worship has become increasingly prevalent in the Somerset Isle.
It seems Somerset Isle has become a much more dangerous place.
Those lines of dialogue were from the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, and hence come from people during the end of the Third Era, shortly before the rise of the Thalmor to prominence. Based also upon other information we have discussed, the late Third Era Somerset Isles was a place of great unrest. Of course, the timeline moves on and the Thalmor consolidates power, but there is one particular storyline I must highlight. In the Elder Scrolls Legends storyline, we hear the tale of the Forgotten Hero and his fight against Lord Narafin as told by the Moth Priest Kellan. Most of this knowledge remains unbeknownst to the public, however, we, through the game, have first-hand experience of Lord Narafin. Lord Narafin was the Thalmor general who led the Aldmeri Dominion to Cyrodiil and took the Imperial City during the Great War. This is known by all, but what they don't know is that Lord Narafin was a devout follower of the Daedric Prince Boethia and was personally leading a cult, working closely with a Dremora named Reeve in order to bring about a Daedric invasion called the Culling. Lord Narafin even managed to begin this culling by opening an Oblivion Gate in the Imperial City, but he was stopped by the Forgotten Hero and their companions. None of this is cited in any of the official stories, and it actually partially contradicts the book, The Great War, which says Lord Narafin was kept alive for 33 days, hanging from the White-Gold Tower. It is not recorded where his body was buried, if it was buried at all. One source claims he was carried off by a winged Daedra on the 34th day. It's interesting to note the idea that he is said to have been carried off by a winged Daedra, which perhaps had something to do with Boethia reclaiming his body or soul or something. Look, this is all Elder Scrolls Legends, which I suppose is actually told by one individual, the Moth Priest Kellan, so perhaps there is an unreliable narrator aspect to it. However, there is precedent of Daedric worship on the Somerset Isles, and perhaps there is some basis to Thalmor cooperation with Daedric entities. We must consider that it was the Oblivion Crisis that provided the opportunity for the Thalmor's rise to power. Their magic is said to have stopped the Oblivion Gates of Somerset, and perhaps that is true. Maybe some pact with Boethia helped close Dagon's Oblivion Gates. Boethia is cited as responsible for the Velothi Exodus, where the Prophet Veloth led people away from Somerset, and to Morrowind, where they became the Chimera and later Dunmer. Perhaps the Daedric Prince of Plots is still meddling with the Altmer, this time having helped spawn a radical reform of the society under the Thalmor. This is all fun and speculation, and to be honest, I haven't historically been a fan of the Elder Scrolls Legends plotline involving Daedra again. I think the Thalmor, as an Altmeri purity supremacist organization violently opposed to Lorkhan, Talos, and mankind in general, is a far more interesting kind of evil. It almost just feels mustache-twirling corny to just add in demon worshipping as well. Anyways, we've explored a lot today. The rise of dominions, the Thalmor, their philosophies, Talos, towers, the Psijjics. It's a lot of great stuff. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed the video and have plenty to think about during the long wait for the Elder Scrolls 6. I'm certain the Elder Scrolls 6 will involve the Thalmor as a major player in the story, and I'm keen to finally see what happens. But until then, patience is the name of the game. Bit of that Psijjic attitude. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a like and subscribe for more epic lore dives just like this. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet. Thanks again, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.